exactly your choice of title. I think it is correct because we are very specific. Got it. I think we are being the objective is to say, how do we tap into the indigenous? And then the outcome, of course, could be then the inclusive governance. So I think it is important to be very specific to say we are talking, but because talking of inclusive governance is very general, but is very specific to say we're looking at the indigenous people's roles and its challenges and opportunities in terms of governance. We are very specific, and then that could lead us to what Mafinisa is suggesting, I think.
Thank you very much. Okay, well, if Sinegugu and Loyiso, perhaps you would like to start with introducing yourselves and then move around to the rest of the group. I wish you a very fruitful discussion, and I'll see you at the end. Thank you all so much for joining again.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll just turn the video on. Good people, my name is Sinegugu, Senem Zukulu, and I'm joining you from the Wild Coast. You will see that I'm joining you from a vehicle because I had to drive to the top of the hill for a good signal point. We have very, very poor signal in these hills in the Wild Coast. So you will excuse me for that. And I'm using my mobile, not a computer. And I'm just hoping that I am trying to charge whilst I use this. So technically, we always challenge in these online meetings. So I will keep my video off in order to save both the battery and also and data. So otherwise, I work for SWC, Sustaining the Wild Coast. And our area here, which is the Amatiba, is part of the Ponderland MPA. I am in Ponderland, in the indigenous people of Ponderland. So it's a pleasure to join you all this morning. Thank you. Yes, could we have the next person? Any volunteer, please? Yo, looks like
I'll go next, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Mr. Sinegugu, for that. My name is Loyiso Dunga. I'm joining you guys from the opposite side of where Sinegugu is. I'm on the West Coast. And I'm joining you from a privileged point. I have good internet connection. Yeah, so we don't have that. Luckily, the office doesn't have that challenge. But it's so important that we are here today representing the different locations and areas in South Africa and the realities. I'm a marine biologist by training. At heart, I'm a conservationist. My journey in the ocean work started in 2016. I was trained as a hydrogeologist, studying groundwater before venturing into the ocean. I found it extremely quite difficult for me trying to come up to speed to other students who have been studying marine biology. But what was quite interesting for me was the moment I started to try and understand all this information overload from the indigenous perspective. I would go home and regurgitate the lectures to my parents, my spouse, but I would use storytelling, which is an African way of conveying important messages, and somehow incredibly complex topics started to stick into my mind. So since then, I've been embracing the power of indigenous knowledge in a science space, and I've been advocating with the little platform I have of importance of indigenous knowledge and teaching young people, everyone, in a language and in a format that is understandable to them. So that is why I'm here today, because I really love conveying messages using indigenous knowledge. I'm looking forward to this discussion. Thank you.
Next one, please.
I'd be happy to introduce myself.
Thank you.
My name is Tanya Brody Rudolph. I live in Cape Town. We just recently moved a little bit out of the city into the country. My training is, I'm a research fellow at the Institute of Sustainability Transitions at Stellenbosch University. I work with a very diverse team who are mostly focused on water issues, social issues, and transition in South Africa towards a just and equitable society. A lot of the focus has been on energy recently, given our reality. But I'm focused specifically on oceans. I work mostly in an international space. A project that I'm busy with at the moment is to establish a new panel for the ocean called an Intergovernmental Panel on Ocean Sustainability. So like a new IPCC for the ocean. We've been working on this for a year and a half with a group of researchers from around the world and institutions from around the world. And it's been really interesting. There are only 2 people from the Global South in the group. I'm one of them. And then we have a Brazilian researcher, social scientist. But what's been fascinating about this project is that we're advocating for the use of all types of knowledge to inform policy decisions, and including all voices in an authentic way, in a way that actually allows legitimate voice, and that actually has an impact on decisions that are made. Because our perspective is that there's a lot of knowledge. Obviously, there's a lot of scientific knowledge, which is held in silos, but there is an enormous resource of Indigenous knowledge that is not utilized, that is not accessed, that is not integrated into policy, which is crazy, because Indigenous communities are the stewards of the land and have been for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So we're working on this much bigger picture of bringing all different types of knowledge into one integrated platform to feed into policy processes like the CBD and the UNFCCC, bringing an ocean focus to the table, because there hasn't been sufficient ocean focus. We've had the one IPCC special report on the ocean, but that was only in 2019 after so many years of assessments, and nothing since then. And the World Ocean Assessment is too slow, and by the time it's published 5 years later, it's already outdated. And it's also very narrow. The only researchers are from the north, and they're politically driven by government agendas. So we need much more broad-based, consensus-driven, community-driven knowledge to be informing ocean policy at a global level. So this is the work we're doing. It's a massive vision. It's a massive project. And it's where I spend a lot of my time. But I also have been working on other projects, like in Kenya, on locally managed marine areas, which has been really interesting. But I'm going to stop talking now and tell you some more later about what I'm doing. So it's very lovely to be here and to meet you and to be having this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya. Can we have another person coming forward, please?
Hi, everyone.
Okay. Oh, no.
Okay.
You say go. Go.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's really nice to meet you and to be here. My name is Ifesina Chioka-Yarwood, and I'm a lecturer in sustainable development at the University of St. Andrews. My current area of research interest is on oceans governance and maritime security, primarily in Western Central Africa. And the sort of work that I do seeks to sort of understand the interaction or intersection between deprivation, especially those resulting from the impact of depleting marine resources, given that millions of Africans depend on marine resources, and how people are then responding to their vulnerabilities. So the impact of the depletion and how that response might directly or indirectly have implications for national security. The reason for this lens is that for so long, and also even till now, the emphasis has been on militarization of maritime security response, so much so that our government and international partners sometimes forget about the human element of it, or trying to understand why exactly might someone that feels deprived, that once was able to make ends meet for their family, might be pushed to use their knowledge of the sea for negative ends. So to trying to show that for us to actually get to the point where we address threats to maritime security holistically, we also need to understand the need to incorporate militarization, which is necessary through law enforcement, but also provision of social goods. This also, through my work, I have tried to center, or should I say, highlight the need to prioritize the voices of the people that actually are affected by these things, because nobody knows the solution to any problem more than the person that is actually living those situations. And a lot of the time, at least in Western Central Africa and other African case studies that I have been privileged to research, they are never really visible in terms of participation in solutions or how things can be done differently. And so, yeah, I think I'm going to stop now. But one of the reasons why I'm very excited about being here is that I'm hoping to start a research around how we can integrate indigenous knowledge with scientific knowledge as a method of marine conservation, rather than the current way of imposing scientific methods from elsewhere, mainly from the global north, on people on the south, especially those on the African continent, even when we have not made the provisions, or should I say the necessary provisions, to ensure that they're able to sort of cope with that such ideas that we're trying to bring forward. And this is very important, especially now that so many countries are signing up to this 30 by 30 that is being pushed by so many people without necessarily thinking about, might there be possible other solutions from within the communities, rather than, you know, importing ideas that might not necessarily reflect the realities, or that might end up making people more vulnerable than they already are. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the conversations we're going to have.
Thank you very much, Ife. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Naya. I come from the Cabo Verde archipelago in West Africa, and I'm very happy to hear what everyone is talking about their research, and because I can see like, oh yes, it's related to my research. Yes, it's related to what I'm doing. Oh yes, they're doing something that I think it's important. So this is very exciting for me to see that, especially within the African context, we are striving for different and taking a different direction, especially when it comes to the ocean and the coastal people. My research is, if I can put it generally, is about integrated coastal zone management. And I think I'm doing my PhD research at the University of Tokyo, but my focus of research is my country, Cabo Verde. So although I'm far, I'm working and I'm collecting data and I'm doing field work in my country. And what I'm trying to do is not just normal policy making and management planning. It's going to the communities and listening to them and understanding what they want for their areas, because they are the primary users. They are the main interest and should be the first beneficiaries of whatever plan we impose or we come up with, better said. And it's been very interesting to see how, at least for the little experience that I've had, communities ended up being included just as consultants. So just as sources to extract information, and then they're not actually included in any decision-making processes. Their actual needs are not actually taken into consideration. It's just to check a box most of the times. So I really looking forward to change that and to bring and find facilitators that can actually bring communities, indigenous communities and their knowledge actual to the table, to the decision-making table, and to shift the focus of, instead, like Ife said, trying to fit international guidelines or frameworks, then we establish our own frameworks, our own guidelines, and trying to reach them based on what the community wants, needs, and expects. So yeah, I'm looking forward for discussion and learning and sharing. Cabo Verde comes from a very interesting setting because historically we didn't have any indigenous communities or any native population. It's a country that literally emerged out of in slavery commerce of people, and it was a spot used to bring all the captured people and to do the trade there in Cabo Verde. So, and I think the fact that our history started in such a traumatic way also plays a very interesting role in the way we deal with the ocean, in the way we also make decisions, and in the way we feel that we own the land or that we don't. So yeah, I'm looking forward for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Naya, for that beautiful intro. Can we have the next person, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Raisa. I feel like the group outlier this morning. I'm representing the High Commission of Canada here in Pretoria. I'd say that I'm here to learn today from all of these very, very smart and experienced people in the field. My work is political. Part of what the High Commission is interested in is, well, Indigenous issues broadly, given that Canada has its own history on these issues, especially when it comes to oceans and Indigenous knowledge, etc. And we're trying to basically just build bridges and find parallels between South Africa and Canada, and possibly explore avenues for cooperation in the future where we can give these communities a voice and do whatever we can to assist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Raisa. Looks like we have Mafa is the person who hasn't introduced himself or herself. Over to you, Mafa.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Sorry I was late. All of a sudden I've got a crisis and I can only stay until about 12:30. You know, my name is Mafani Sohara. I'm from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies at University of the Western Cape. I'm a professor there for natural resource governance. We are an institute that does research in land and agrarian issues and also natural resource management. So that's my area. The last 20, 30 years, my work has mainly been on the inclusive natural resource governance, especially fisheries. So I've been dealing or working on the issues around co-management, community-based management, so on and so forth in the region. I was invited by Moria to be part of this group and explore what opportunities would be to be part of the group going forward. So I'm mainly here to listen to what the group is going to be proposing going forward, and also what inputs I can provide in terms of the strategies around next year's conference or something like that. So I'm not so sure whether I'm making much sense, but that's where I come from, and that's where I'm here today. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. People said you will have to. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, we are. Thank you very much, Prof, for introducing yourself. And I do hope that you will participate. We all here, remember, we all strangers to one another, but now that we've introduced ourselves, we are familiar with each other, and we hope that we can all contribute this body of knowledge from our own areas of the expertise. I think I must add, in terms of myself, I've told you that I'm coming from Bondoland, the indigenous people of Mbondoland and Mampondo, and for my sins, I live along the MPA, but I have recently co-authored a paper that we have just published with academics from the University of Stellenbosch, talking about mangroves and also talking about whether the governance of marine resources, whether the indigenous people are, and our findings have proven that we still have a long way to go in South Africa in terms of trying to include and to involve the people who live adjacent to the ocean in its governance. Also, I am a lead applicant in the case against Shell in South Africa. Most of you should be aware that Shell has applied to do seismic survey for oil and gas in our ocean in the Wild Coast of South Africa, and we have gone to court to block that. We interdicted them, and fortunately, we won the interdict. They were able to put the whole thing on hold up until we had the main hearing, the main review, which happened now end of May, and we are awaiting judgment on that matter. Having said all that, I just want you to understand in terms of where I come from within the space of the marine and protected areas. But I would like, so we are focusing in our discussion, as you're all aware, that we are looking at the indigenous people's stewardship of marine or of the MPAs. And we are looking in particular at the challenges. What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And therefore, I hope people are open to for me, I hope you are going to be able to give me the opportunity to pick and choose people and ask them to share. I am going to start with, you must please pardon me. So all of you, I'm sure you are ready now, expecting your names to be called. So could we please start with you, Naya, and after Naya, we will come to Ifi. And just, we would like you to reflect on this. We're looking at what are the challenges, what are the opportunities in terms of getting the indigenous people involved in the stewardship and the conservation of the marine living resources, or of the MPAs that are adjacent to their territories, or even the management of the ocean and the ocean resources in general. Thank you.
Oh, wow. That's a hot topic. It's what we're here to do. So just to put a bit of context, I come from a biology background, and I was lucky enough to study as well at the University of Cabo Verde. And I started as a conservationist, heavily focused, determined conservationist, and quite radicalized conservationist. And that's also kind of the approach that Cabo Verde has when it comes to conservation. And Cabo Verde is one of the most important spots in the world for the nesting of sea turtles. All the species either migrate there as a feeding ground or as a ground for juveniles to grow. But nesting site is also one of the most important sites for some species. And while I was doing my academic studies, I would go to these conservation areas where we have monitoring camps, stay there all summer, studying sea turtles, doing conservation, tagging, and doing everything. And something very interesting happened in, I think it was in 2013, that just to put it into context, in Cabo Verde, it's completely forbidden to hunt sea turtles. It used to be a habit for people during the nesting season to hunt and eat the meat. It was a tradition. But as it became an endangered species and protected species, and with the new international laws and guidelines, it was completely prohibited. But well, people still did it. But then there was a point in which it started to be criminalized, and in the way to try to increase the efforts, right, to protect the species. And I think after 5 years ago, since 5 years ago, sorry, it's now you actually go to jail or you receive a penalty if you're fined either eating or killing or commercializing sea turtles meat. Well, all fine. But I think my point is the conservation program in Cabo Verde started as a radical shift from people that were used to traditionally eat the meat and consume it without feeling that they were doing a crime. It was a tradition. Then to all of a sudden, total prohibition with no whatsoever socialization of the idea. And in many islands of Cabo Verde, it's literally part of their summer traditions to go to the beach, to hunt one sea turtle and to eat the meat, whether people might agree with it or not, but it was the tradition. And when all of a sudden you prohibit and you say your tradition is a crime in such a harsh way, it can be very confusing for people. And it might take people both, either way, either people accept, don't understand it, but accept, or people get angry and revolt. And just to aggravate the situation, the organizations that were put in charge of doing monitoring and conservation in these areas were all foreigners, European foreigners, NGOs going there, bringing biologists from abroad and coming and telling the people what to do and what not to do, and basically criminalizing whatever they were doing and showing you're doing very wrong and very wrong and very wrong. So a very non-educational approach, to say the least. So the situation, this started in 1998. That was the first time that it was completely prohibited to catch or hunt sea turtle. And the situation just escalated. And it culminated with me in 2013. I was working in these monitoring camps, and the situation had gotten so bad because people were not following the law, of course, that the government felt the need, along with these foreigner NGOs, to bring militaries to the beach, to patrol the beach, to avoid people from catching sea turtles. And of course, the situation escalated and the people started provoking the militaries. There was even a day where there was a conflict and the military fired against people. And people started hunting sea turtles and leaving the meat there, not even taking it to consume, just to make a statement. So that led then, first, it led the NGOs to say, okay, we're not doing a good job. We need to change our approach. So first, they started to start engaging with the communities and actually listening to them, to what they want. But still they couldn't get through. And then all of a sudden they realized, oh, maybe having white European NGOs leading the way of the conversation is not the best way. Maybe we should have Cape Verdeans in the forefront of this. And I can gladly say that now the scenario is much different, that we have most of the environmental NGOs working in Cabo Verde be led by Cape Verdean scientists, biologists, volunteers. Of course, it's not that it's not welcoming people from all nationalities, but it's different when you have your own people in front and in charge of your resources and what you're doing with it, and establishing the conversation as well with the local communities. And now, although it's a crime, it's prohibited 100% to hunt sea turtles, there is more of a conversation and understanding. First, why the community was hunting sea turtles. Well, it was a tradition, but it was also a social economic need. A fisherman in Cabo Verde can make up to a month $100 a month. If you hunt one sea turtle, the revenue of it will be $80, just one sea turtle. So economically speaking, and coastal communities in my country are very vulnerable socioeconomically, it doesn't make much sense for you to prohibit them to hunt and to get the money that they need, unless if you provide them with an alternative. So there's a lot of things to cover, but I guess this is just the start, and I'm sorry for being so long, but just to give you this case of my country, of how when we govern or when we think about ocean management, and when we think about local communities, how sometimes if we just come with an idea and with a theory that maybe it's applied elsewhere, it doesn't really make sense in our local context, and how important it is to listen to the communities, listen to them first, understand their history first. And maybe prohibitive measures might not be, in many cases, the best approach. And yes, I think there's a lot of layers to it, but yeah, that would be, I think, my initial statement on that. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, Naya, for that narrative and storytelling in terms of taking us into the background as to what transpired, the whole history of the conservation and the challenges thereof. And because through that narrative, we're able to pick up exactly the challenges, because the challenges you are mentioning, actually, they are not unique to your country. Otherwise, those are the challenges that globally, in terms of how the conservation as a concept was introduced, where the local communities, they are seen as the problem in terms of the conservation, where they are disregarded, where they are told. So thank you very much. And you have also ended off by giving us, in terms of the solution, what would make the conservation efforts work, and how they are working within. And again, those things, they are common. So even in terms of the law enforcement, the best way, the capacity building, the engagements, and open. So thank you very much. Can we therefore proceed to Ife Okafor and hear your experience and your side of the experience in this topic? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks also, Naya. The experience you shared resonates with what I know. I am Nigerian, and I could also say I am from one of the Niger Delta states in Nigeria, even though I am not from the, when you hear Niger Delta, you might hear about militancy resulting from the fact that people got tired of the degradation by the multinational oil companies and the government not doing anything about it, and not actually benefiting from the resources that has been extracted from their waters, and decided that perhaps maybe the only way they can listen to us is through violence. And I share this example, should I say, I start with this story because I think it also sort of helps us make sense of what could go wrong if indigenous communities continue to be ignored. So it's actually counterproductive to the long-term vision of sustainability or economic growth for any country if you do not listen to the people that actually are affected by some of the issues that we're talking about. So with that said, the challenges that I see through my work, be it with the research that I've done in Nigeria or the Western Central African countries, is that consistently, when it comes to issue of the maritime sector in general, be it for example, ideas or visions of expanding port infrastructure. For example, if you were talking about the case in Cameroon, or even expansion of port infrastructure in Cote d'Ivoire, or even Nigeria and other countries that increasingly are interested to tap into the opportunities from their blue economy sector, we find that continuously, despite what we say or despite what we see about the impact of climate change, for example, on depleting fish stock, we see that communities that once relied on a particular fishing ground or traditional fishing grounds are almost always the ones that are affected without necessarily being consulted. So the government can make a decision, oh, we're going to expand the port here, we're going to do this here, we're going to do that here. And the next thing you see people working without the people that actually use the resources in those adjacent environment being consulted. We also see it with the increasing interest in offshore oil exploration, where communities lose fishing grounds again because prospecting have to happen, and in cases where they find oil, they might then have to install pipelines, which means that by law it becomes illegal to go back to the areas that has been traditionally fished by these people. Remember, again, we have this idea of the impact of climate change and depletion, and then you have port infrastructure taken away, oil exploration taken away. And when it comes to fishing, again, we see the really difficult relationship between interest in generating revenue from distant water fishing nations or industrial sector, and how it is affecting the artisanal communities or local communities that for years have relied on fishing, not only to make ends meet, but also to support their families, with women and men being adversely affected. So some of the challenges they face is basically a case of being visible, but invisible. You know, they are there, but they're actually not seen when it comes to thinking about what might be the potential impact of our decision on people that actually rely on these resources for livelihood. So the government basically ignore them as people that are perhaps powerless, illiterate, do not know anything, therefore we can get around them. So it no longer becomes a case of taking from them, it also becomes a case of not hearing from them, and also not compensating them. Because actually when you interact with some communities that have been affected by these issues, some of them agree there might be a need for us to do ABC, but it's a case of the way you're doing it is not right. Or a case of, hang on a minute, whilst you're doing this, what do we do? What about compensation? And it's sometimes just a case of having an agreement and compensating, and everything would be okay if you actually had the wherewithal to enforce the rule you're trying to implement. I can share an example of also how political decisions are unfortunately undermining or threatening the rights of Indigenous communities and undermine their livelihoods. And this relates to the need for conservation of marine resources. So many countries are introducing measures such as closed fishing season. The idea of marine protected area is being touted by so many people, with a lot of the times, unfortunately, pressure from international communities. And I can also talk about 30 by 30 because over 100 countries have already signed up or committed to this. And 30 by 30 is I guess you could say, a policy wherein governments and people are committing to saving or safeguarding 30% of the earth by the year 2030. And if we look historically, when it comes to measures of conservation and who have almost always been affected, it's always Indigenous communities. Even though they have a voice, even though they are visible, they're actually voiceless and invisible. And now we have this thing that is being touted as the only solution without necessarily seeing countries in the global north, the biggest polluters, the biggest culprit when we talk about, contributing to the impact of the mess we're in right now, not taking the first necessary step, in making commitments to what can be done differently. And so we have actually so many countries on the African continent thinking about MPAs, talking about MPAs, which is amazing, but hang on a minute, what happens to those communities that once fished from those areas you're trying to designate as MPAs? Have you actually consulted them? Have you actually thought about how they are going to be compensated? Have you explored ideas around complementary sources of livelihoods or the impact, the long-term impact this is going to have on them and their families? And so these are just some examples of, you know, the impact or the challenges that Indigenous communities faced. And you can say the same about closed seasons as well, wherein they are importing ideas, which is great, based on, you know, biological evidence of maybe relaxing fishing for a while and then continuing fishing. But then the question that begs for an answer is, whilst you can do this for industrial vessels or industrial sector, and they then have an ability to move from your country to another country during the closed season period, artisanal or local fishers do not have the same capability. And unless you're making provision for alternative livelihood or diversified livelihood so that they can actually have a way of making ends meet in the closed season period, you are making them more vulnerable and pushing them further into poverty and risking peace and security of your country, because it's only as human. I mean, there's so much someone can take, especially when they feel that nobody listens to them. There are so many examples of people protesting when they feel, and I started my talk with the Niger Delta area for that reason, just so you know what could go wrong if you continue to ignore people or push them to the ground. That said, there are also evidence of great things that are happening in terms of Indigenous communities using their voices to make their governments accountable. We see examples from different countries on the continent. The South African example on the issue of Shell is something that is more recent and needs to be applauded. Nigerian communities in the Niger Delta have been fighting against Shell, have taken Shell on for years, for decades, and actually they continue to win, even though challenges remain, even though remediation have never necessarily happened in so many communities. And now these international corporations are finding ways by selling off oil wells, and then accountability ends up being lost because you don't know who you're going to hold accountable. There is actually evidence of them coming together, saying no, enough. This cannot continue to happen. And then effectively bringing about people being held accountable. And we're also seeing increasingly Indigenous voices being heard and given a chance and, you know, being consulted. We might not necessarily have seen it being sort of implemented when it comes to, you've listened to me, and then you're taking what I've said into account. We are not necessarily there, but at least what we're seeing is that they are being listened to more. They are being invited to forums more, although a lot more needs to be done. And this whole issue of language being a barrier, or, oh no, they're illiterate, oh, they don't understand, oh, it's so complex. I actually remember, I think I'm gonna round off with a story of a recent event that I attended. And this is just to highlight how organizations are also trying to do their best to ensure that, you know, some of the things we might cite as examples of things that are stopping us from including Indigenous communities are sort of addressed. So this happens to be a case of someone was invited to be part of a stakeholder meeting to address some of the issues around the maritime. And they didn't have a bank account, but one of the evidence of being supported to come to that event is that you needed a letter from your bank and things like that. It was so complex that the organization ended up bending their rules to make sure that the person got there. I know that in this day and age where fraud is an issue, but the willingness to actually bend your rule to ensure that people that matters are heard is very important. I know that personally, I'm nobody's spokesperson. I'm a Nigerian. I can speak about these issues because it affects me. I'm an African as well. But on a very good day, I feel that there's more evidence of organizations on the African continent and also those from the global north who have not necessarily listened in previous times. There are actually evidence of them being willing to listen and learn and center the voices of Indigenous communities on the continent. We just need to find ways to ensure that it's not just, it doesn't stop at listening, but also implementing some of the things that you hear from them. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ife, for sharing all those insights about, yes, how the people, and also thanks for bringing in the question of the oil and gas exploration by multinational corporations. And also, yes, I know you have got lots of stories to share about Nigeria and the Niger Delta in terms of what is happening there in Ogoniland. But thank you for bringing that into spotlight. We're now going to continue to hear from Tanya and all the work that she's also doing. Over to you, Tanya.
Thank you so much. It's really, really wonderful to listen to these different perspectives. I just feel super inspired to just work harder at addressing these issues. So where to start? There's so many things. I think I'm going to try and focus in on challenges and opportunities because we've had beautiful stories, and I can give you some stories of that I've been a part of. But I think the important thing is to look at how do we fix this issue, because we all acknowledge here that there is a problem. Indigenous knowledge is not taken into account at the highest levels of governance, especially at intergovernmental levels, sufficiently. And even though there are shifts starting to happen, as we've heard, we need much, much more work on that. And I love the comment about you can't use the fact that there's a communication issue to share knowledge because of language or because of education. I think storytelling is probably the most powerful way of sharing information that we have. And this is in our DNA as human beings. Throughout time, we've shared information through storytelling. And I think this is one of the very powerful ways that we can share in-depth Indigenous knowledge with the world on global platforms. And this is one of the things that we need to be working towards, just educating people from this vast depth of knowledge that exists in these communities. So an example of a success story, which I think could be very useful for us in the African continent to model, is Belize. In Belize, their reef, the community is completely reliant on the ocean to survive. They also have a complex trauma relationship with their ocean because of colonialism. But what they've done has been incredibly successful. Their reef was on the list of endangered reefs in UNESCO. And they started a community, an ocean approach, which involved a bottom-up approach from communities and a top-down approach from a ministerial level. And from the top-down approach, they set up an ocean ministry with ocean-focused members that were experts. And from a bottom-up approach, they started going around their communities and creating leadership gatherings and really listening to their communities and understanding the knowledge and the impacts that they were experiencing from all the climate change impacts and strategies that were working, innovations that were working. And they shared this information in a coalesced way with the top-down approach. And so the government actually wrote legislation which reflected the knowledge that they'd received from their communities. And then that was implemented at a provincial level and then down at a local level. And it's been an unbelievably successful process. Their reef is now off the endangered list. And they are one of the sort of examples of what is possible if you work together with communities and if governance becomes more integrated. So I think a couple of those kind of case studies would be really useful to look at for the African continent and look at the steps that were taken and actually create a sort of framework that could be replicated in different African countries. There are other tools that we could be looking at as well, like we've spoken about closed fisheries and that can impact communities, and I absolutely agree with that. It can, but there are some really useful tools that if you use them in the correct way, if they're science driven and if they're implemented correctly with an understanding of the context. So, for example, rights-based fisheries management in Chile, they have a tool that they use called TURFs, Territorial User Right Management. And it's been a very successful way of managing fisheries. And the way that it works is run by the communities themselves. They have leaders that they elect in the communities, and they decide themselves what the catch should be, what the catch limits should be, because they know the fishery, they know the stock that's there, and they decide, okay, for this season, we can see that to be sustainable, we can only catch however many tons. There are 50 fishers associations. We divide it equally between everyone, and everyone gets their allocated portion, and they actually police themselves. They actually have their own system of ensuring that everyone complies because they know it's for their communal benefit. So there are those kind of interventions that we can also look at. And then I just wanted a quick word on MPAs, because I know there's obviously, if has a strong opinion about how MPAs can be very impactful for local communities. But just want to point out that if MPAs are implemented scientifically, and not just randomly, but in a scientifically strategic way, they can actually be incredibly effective. Where there's a study by Sala et al., where they showed that if we protected 21% of the ocean strategically, so that means 21% of the correct part of the ocean, where there are biodiversity hotspots, where they're not hot or acidic, we can get 90% of the biodiversity benefits. So less than 30% can actually solve almost all the problems, but that just has to be done strategically. And I acknowledge that in some of those marine protected areas, there may well be some communities that are impacted. And in that event, there have to be alternative integrated strategies, like, for example, bringing in tourism, sustainable tourism into the marine protected areas, so that all of those fishers for the season or a couple of seasons that are impacted can rotate and have other employment opportunities or create new kinds of economies. But that is one of the ways that we're actually going to end up with a sustainable ocean for the whole of humanity, is to give the ocean chances to rest and recover. But absolutely, it has to be done. It has to be done in a way that makes sense for local communities, because they are completely and totally reliant on them. So those are some ideas. I love the idea of making visible what is not visible. Yes, this is what we need to do. This is part of the work we're doing in the IPAS, is to bring these communities to the table, and in a way that's authentic within the community as well, not just bringing someone just to have a face, but someone who can actually speak on behalf of the community, who is respected by their community, and who can go back with a plan that is accepted by the community as being legitimate and representative of their needs and requirements. And then the last thing was, in terms of Shell, I think a really important thing to notice is that the Human Rights Commission recently issued a statement on granting a human rights to the environment. This is a very, very significant thing. For 45 years, we have not had a human right to the environment. And even though in South Africa, we have a constitutional right to an environment, it's not the case everywhere in the world, but it's never been a human right, like a human right to life or human right to freedom. The Human Rights Commission said there is a human right to the environment. What this means is that they can then, if the UN accepts this, there can be accountability to individuals. The problem with Shell in Nigeria was that accountability was between states, because the only forum in which to have those conversations was in the International Courts of Justice, where it's governments against governments. But if you make Shell responsible or accountable to individuals or to NGOs, that changes the game completely, because then accountability can actually be turned into financial gain for the communities that are impacted. So this is a very important trend that's happening in the world, and something we really all need to support, the human right to the environment, because then accountability becomes real. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for that contribution. You have brought in here some really interesting points, even in terms of the way forward, what could be done. I just want to mention, just to add on what the previous call, I'm coming to you there, Prof. What the other colleagues have said. For instance, in our area within the MPA, one of the challenges that we find is that the law enforcement agencies are busy harassing the local people who are, in our case, with the wild coast, is very wild ocean. So we don't at all get into the ocean and go offshore. Unlike, I know that our neighbors in Mozambique, they have flat oceans, they go. So here people stand on the shoreline, they will harvest your shellfish. In particular, the close season is mainly about the crayfish and all that. But despite all that, the people are coming from the nearby province like KZN. They have got boats. We don't even have a boat launching site here. We, as much as we are the ones housing the MPA, it's in our area, and people, they do not go offshore. They don't have, so they use, those who are fishing, they fish from the shoreline. But the boats coming from about 25 k's away on the KZN, they come to our area. They will fish within the MPA area. But that's not the worst. The worst is at night. We have all these foreign trawlers that come in at night, very close to the shoreline, into the MPA area. They switch off the lights, they switch off their engines, they start catching fish, and just before the day breaks, they then take off. You report these things to the authorities, and they do absolutely nothing. So these trawlers, every night, the people who go out fishing at night, they see them. These are the biggest culprits, but law enforcement agencies are busy harassing the people, the local communities who have got very little. And I think here, of course, solutions have been given here to say we need to make sure that the monitoring of these MPAs, as the examples you gave, for instance, from one country, that it's important for them to be done by the local people, because the local people, they'll be able to check those quotas. Other things which have been said by Ife in terms of the consultation of the local people, decisions being made, and making sure that it is not a token consultation, but it's a real consultation. I like the example, Tanya, you gave of how the legislation was done. By considering and first listening to the local people. And I think out of all of these stories and these narratives that we are putting forward, we are seeing a very a good body of knowledge and suggestions in terms of the way forward. So what could be done? But I would like, before we actually move into to try and look into the way forward, what do we think now, coming up with the solutions for way forward? How do we manage the situation? But before we do so, I'd like to go to Mafa and give him an opportunity to also to come on board and share his thoughts, given the work that he's doing in the institute that he works for. Thank you. Over to you, Mafa.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting and exciting to listen to people talking about issues around Ogoniland, was that Ife? And also other issues around the tattoos that Naya was talking about. Thanks for the opportunity for me to share my insights before I leave. As I said, I can only stay until about 12:30. But for me and the work that I've been doing, the use or utilization of indigenous knowledge when it comes to management of natural resources is a perspective that, as the other speakers have said, being left outside the Western type of management strategies or management approaches. And in our work, we have actually quite a number of examples of cases where the utilization of indigenous knowledge and local knowledge are actually resulting in sustainable solutions compared to the top-down approach that the governments usually impose on communities. So when it comes to use of indigenous knowledge and local knowledge, when it comes to management of resources or governance of resources, the issue is that usually you are allowing a broader knowledge, a broader suite of knowledge that would actually be used to come up with regulations. As the other speakers have said, the users, the community users, are usually on the ground utilizing the resource every day and every season. They know the changes, they know what is happening, so on and so forth. And yet what usually happens, or what has happened in what you can call conventional approaches, is we call ourselves more knowledgeable or scientists. We come and do what we, in fisheries you can call, even in wildlife, stock assessment, and based on that, you come up with the levels of asbestos that will result in sustainable utilization, so on and so forth, ignoring what actually the users are doing, and also they know about the resource itself. We usually assume that actually users are the problem, and we need to impose rules and regulations in order for us to achieve sustainable utilization of resource, which they are also using. They are using, or they were using even before we came. The argument there is, would people really try and destroy a resource that they are using or they depend on? In most instances, communities are quite aware of their activities and how they can utilize a resource in such a way that other generations of their communities can also depend on benefit from it. So the issue is that when we take cognizance of local knowledge and indigenous knowledge, the benefits are that we have a broader array of choices and things that we can use when it comes to coming up with management strategies. Also, as I said, communities are on the ground every day, all the seasons, and they know the changes. So they've got a huge amount of knowledge that could be usefully used when it comes to coming up with the type of strategies that should be used to manage resources sustainably. The other issue is the issue of legitimacy, that when you acknowledge and realize that the communities, user communities, have got also solutions to the issues and problems, and also they're also acknowledged as having that kind of role, the issue of legitimacy comes into play. By that I mean that communities or user communities see any kind of management strategies that they have taken part in coming up with as legitimate, whereas those that are imposed without their concerns being heard and also their opinions being used, they will normally see them as illegitimate, as illegitimate. So we usually talk about two types of legitimacy. One is what we can call content legitimacy, and the second is what you can call procedural legitimacy. By content legitimacy, I'm talking about the fact that the content of the rules and regulations are legitimate if user communities have participated in coming up with them. In terms of procedure, what I'm talking about there is the fact that because communities are involved in terms of coming up with the rules and regulations and the procedures in determining these, they will see the rules and regulations and the whole process as legitimate. So you will have a much better chance of communities following these regulations. As Naya said, in the talk in her input on the tattoos, communities came to the point of showing that they were pissed off with what was being imposed by simply killing tattoos and bringing them out there. So these are the type of things that I'm talking about, that knowledge, acknowledgement of knowledge, indigenous knowledge and local knowledge by authorities is important also for legitimacy, both content and procedural legitimacy. The other thing is that it also acknowledging and also utilizing indigenous and local knowledge results in what you can call downward accountability, that authorities are actually acknowledging that they are accountable to people on the ground by consulting them and also asking for their inputs when it comes to management strategies and management approaches that should be put in place for utilization of a resource that they are using and depending on. So there are a number of ways we can justify, or we can actually see or confirm the importance of utilization of indigenous and local knowledge. Before I close, I'll give you an example. As I said, and I didn't say probably that I have been working in both marine and the inland resources. I'll give you an example of two cases in Malawi where we had very clear knowledge of the utilization and the impact of local and indigenous knowledge. One is a very small lake called Lake Chiuta, where it's a very rural area and the government has not had any impact when it comes to, or it hasn't been involved. It was not even, it didn't even have regulations for that lake. But at a certain stage in the 90s, migrant fishers from other areas started flooding the area using gears that were destructive for the very shallow lake and also a very small resource. So these migrant fishers were using beach seines and other inshore seine nets. Yet the local communities who had been utilizing this lake for a long time were using gill nets, traps, so on and so forth. So what the local communities did was to invite government to eject these migrant fishers because they were destroying their resource, or i.e. the resource that belonged to the local community. Government did not take action. So what the local community did was to give notice to the migrants to say you have to move out by such date. If you don't, we're going to throw you out. The migrant fishers had some of them had bribed local chiefs, so on and so forth. They thought they would be protected. But when the day came when that they were supposed to leave and they had not left, they were violently ejected. Their boats and their nets were bent, and most of them were beaten up. So this is the kind of situation that you can come up, it can come to when it comes to ignoring people's knowledge of a resource and how it should be utilized. After that, the local communities banned the utilization of sand nets in the lake, and also they put in place rules and regulations on their own, saying that they will only accept migrant fishers who come through the local committee, which actually they formed, and it excluded chiefs because the chiefs were corrupt. So they said that only migrant fishers who come through the committee and they have been accepted will be allowed to fish on the lake. And they put on a lot of very detailed regulations on their own, not written anywhere else, but the committee knew, and all fishers knew what kind of regulations were to be used for utilization of that resource. So that's the type of local and indigenous knowledge that you could say that it's bottom up. It was only after that that government came into play, and then they legitimized the system of management of that lake by the community on its own, utilizing the rules and regulations that the community had come up with. The other example I'll give you is there's a small island offshore on Lake Malawi called Mbenje Island. That island is very rich when it comes to inshore pelagic sardines and so on and so forth. But you are only allowed to stay on the island and fish from there around the island for about 6 months. The other 6 months is closed. And that is that has been like that for centuries or at least decades. And there's an official date when the local chief goes to open the fishery and close it. Before and after that, you cannot go and live on that island and fish from the island. So when the season is open, you will find that there are over 400 fishers with their gears catching a lot of fish for the 6 months that it's open. And government has got nothing to do with it. It's all local communities through their chief that determine who can fish there, when they can fish, and what type of gears they can use. So these are some of the examples that I wanted to share with you when it comes to indigenous and local knowledge, and the importance and the impact it can have on not only on the management of resources, but also on the livelihoods of local communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mafa, for sharing those insights with us. I know that you are very close to the time to depart, but thank you very much for leaving us with all those insights, and we shall make sure we incorporate them in our outputs out of these discussions. So thank you very much. We're gonna go to Pavs Pillay, who has just joined us after we had started, to introduce herself and also to make a contribution. Then after Pillay, we shall go to Raisa from the Canadian Commission. Yeah, so let's go on that route. Thank you.
Thank you so much. First of all, apologies for pitching up late. There's just too many meetings happening at the same time. My name is Pavs Pillay. I'm from WWF South Africa, and I sit within the Business Development Unit at WWF South Africa. My overall focus is looking at behavior change and how do we shift behavior so that it becomes more pro-environmental and the decision-making becomes an informed decision-making. I have a formalized degree in marine biology. So I have, that's my formative education, but I have subsequently moved into various elements. Within my current portfolio at WWF, I work in sustainable consumption and production, particularly around sustainable seafood. I work in the area of sustainable wine production, food loss and waste, plastics in our oceans, and then a large portion is working within the business development unit around how do we transform market supply chains to be more sustainable. So I work with all the big retailers, and I also work with some of our corporate partners looking at how do we change their behavior to ensure that their business is transformed. In terms of what we're discussing today, I mean, generally, I think ocean sciences have to start more embracing and fully integrating Indigenous knowledge into the work and how we actually produce the products we want to in order to get to the desired results. I have been part of one too many workshops, as Martha would know, where the slower, the Indigenous voices have been ignored, and as a result, every energy and investment that has been placed into that solution has failed miserably because Indigenous voices haven't been heard. People's understanding of the oceans haven't been heard. Their contribution to the oceans hasn't been heard, and what they receive, whether that be an extractive takes or whether they're removing fish, whether that be a cultural or spiritual connection, whether that be a religious connection, or even whether it be a recreational legacy connection, has been ignored. And as a result, whatever innovation we've come up with as an organization to try and shift behavior around how a resource is utilized, where the efforts are being put, has failed because we haven't considered the Indigenous knowledge. From the work that we've been doing at WWF, we've come to realize that there is a wealth of Indigenous knowledge available. We work very strongly in the Kugelberg area, in the Overberg, with coastal communities. And one of my biggest takeaways is that it took us 6 years just to build trust. And progress in any project around the oceans travels at the pace of trust. Until you develop those trustworthy relationships with the communities you're working with, until you understand their inputs and the value that they bring to a project, and then fully integrate it into whatever project you're working with. We have found at WWF with our small-scale fisheries projects, they don't work. At no point are you understanding the context of what we call helicopter science, where we fly in and we tell communities what's good for them and then fly back out. You have to kind of fully embrace it and embed yourself in the project. So with some of the work that we're doing, we're realizing that communities have a lot to offer. Simple lessons around fish and fisheries extraction, whether their own challenges and their struggles, that has to be part of the project design, co-creation, complete prototyping. And a very big lesson is no project is finalized. Everything is iterative. You have to be flexible and adaptable to know it's going to change, to know that your solution might not work, to know that communities might start facing other challenges. So by way of example, when COVID hit, our project stopped, but not realizing the value that our project was actually bringing to the Kugelberg community. And because of the lockdown, they couldn't go out and do the work. So they couldn't get paid to do the work. So there will always be challenges. So we have to be iterative, and they will give you lessons that you'll find in no science textbook, which is something that must be built in. And once you get the trust, once they feel part of the project, once communities start working together, your project succeeds with the least amount of effort or energy. We've also found that with our work in communities are unbelievably resilient and accepting of innovative technological solutions. You can go into any community and people are on Facebook. So learn what your community has at their disposal. One of the things that we found out when we started working in the Kugelberg area is that we went in there thinking, we're going to look at how do we deal with extractive reefs from the oceans? How do we deal with understanding sustainability? How do we deal with diversifying livelihoods? But their primary issue was around early childhood development. So you might not even, you might want to go down one area, but the community's requirements need you to take a tangent. And you have to be accepting of that and build that flexibility in that room in whatever innovation you want to. Communities by nature are stewards of the ocean. That's it. That's something you don't have to sell. Most coastal communities we found are stewards of the ocean. They rely heavily on the ocean. They have severe and very strong ties to the ocean already. So that part you don't have to sell at all. It's just how we work together to ensure that we access the resources. There's inclusivity, but there's also equity around the project. And those two become very important. And immediately people show their value for the ocean. So one of the ways we've tried to do that is we use a lot of the small scale fishers in that area to actually be part of our citizen science component. And they actually go out and deploy BROVs. So I don't know if you guys know what BROVs are. They're these underwater baited remote cameras. And instead of the scientists going out and deploying it, the fishermen actually go out and they deploy it. They're amazing. They know, and they'll tell you straight, it's not going to happen today. The weather's crap. And as a scientist, I would have gone out. But then when you look at the weather, it really is crap. So they go out, they deploy it for us. They collect the material for us. And then we've trained, I think it's 5 community members to actually be able to identify the fish in the on the camera work. What's phenomenal there is these guys are just amazing in terms, they identify the fish faster than a trained marine biologist does. But it's allowed for full integration of them seeing the value of the science that is then informing their catches. It's informing what they're seeing when they go out to sea. And automatically they feel like they've become part of the project as opposed to us telling them, look, this is what we found. And we've dealt a lot with the youth in that area, in the Kuchenberg area, and we're trying to use that model now with our project in Hamburg, which is a climate-focused project looking at how do we get coastal communities to build resilience around climate impacts, and then hopefully into some of our other study sites in Port Nolloth and some other study sites further up the East Coast. So, I think it's vitally important to understand that there already exists a predisposition to Indigenous stewardship around the ocean, and we just need to be able to harness that and fully integrate that in whatever project we're wanting to work on or look at. We also need to understand that looking at alternative and supplementary livelihoods, so we diversify the livelihoods that coastal communities have access to becomes imperative, purely because if we don't, there's, with the climate impacts, with the ocean impacts, there's just not going to be enough fish in the sea to service everybody. So we have to diversify livelihoods in that way, but not in diversify in such a way that the community must want to do it, so that there's buy-in and that the community see benefits of it, and there's long-term relationship building and partnerships in those livelihood diversifications. The other thing as well that we're finding, which is, I guess it's by trial and learning, is that the communities, they love the awareness building. They love to be part of going to schools, talking about their own experiences at sea, their own experiences fishing, and then sharing that with the kids at school. So we've kind of trained 2 guys from the community through the Two Oceans Aquarium, looking at environmental education and how you actually get that to schools, get the kids to talk about it, get kids to understand basic things around quotas and total allowable catches and why the government does certain things. For at least a year, our officers where fishermen came in with their ID books and said, please help me fill in this fishing permit because it's in English and I only speak Afrikaans. So immediately you see the challenges and the unfortunate frictions that local communities face. And we were able to help. And then we said to DFFE, you need to put the form in Afrikaans because guys don't speak English. You know, simple behavioral mechanisms that then can make a massive difference to how many people would register for a fishing permit, or to people's, nature and conduciveness to actually follow the rules and fill in the permit. And that's where the magic really happens, is when people see they're being valued by simple things like that, and then they start telling you about, oh, we went fishing and we didn't catch anything, or we only saw things on the red list, or it was a bad day, or actually there's only undersized rock lobsters that was in the water, and they're sharing information that would have taken scientists or NGOs years and years together, are immediately being shared, being partnered with, and then there's a mutual understanding of, we all want to look after this ocean together as a community, and this is how we're going to look forward to. And then just in conclusion, the last bit of our work has been around trying to understand once you leave a community, what is the sustainability of the projects, of the work that's being done there. And what we're trying to do is we're looking with our sustainable finance team, we're looking at how do we put in place mechanisms around innovative business finance that can then support small-scale fishers. So one of the biggest issues that small-scale fishers and small producers face is they have no credit record. So if they go to a bank to ask for a loan, they have no credit record, they have no business record, so it becomes very difficult. So how do we find mechanisms, innovative financial mechanisms that allow them to be able to access funding, whether it's through the DBSA or whether it's through a big bank like Nedbank, etc. And that's something that our finance team is working towards as well. And also then how do we get them to understand the value of marine protected areas? We have a horrible legacy around marine protected areas being places of exclusion, being places where people were displaced, and they marine protected areas serve a purpose, but for most coastal communities in South Africans, it's seen as a place that I'm not allowed to go. It brings a legacy of inaccessibility. And one of the things we're looking at is how do we build back those relationships around marine protected areas? And then how do we finance marine protected areas so that coastal communities can access them? Because, if you lived close by or you live near, it shouldn't be exclusionary to you because that's your home. And how do we get communities to then access marine protected areas, access resources within marine protected areas, and then stay within the limits of the catches that we have within marine protected areas, and actually see the value of marine protected areas in and around the areas that they live and exist and thrive, because that's what you want ultimately. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take any questions guys might have.
Thank you very much, Pabs, for your very valuable contribution that you have given here. And I'd like to, we are left with about 8 minutes or so. And I'd like to give this, Raisa has asked to remain, as she said in the beginning, as an observer. So Loiso, I'd like to give you an opportunity now. And also what I'm planning to do is to ensure that you are chairing the after lunch session. So I'd like to give you time now so that you have an opportunity to say most of the things you want to contribute, so that because we're in the after lunch spot, I'd be happy to be relieved as well, so that you take over and you're able to chair that session. So this is your moment, the 8 minutes up until 10:02 when we break for lunch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair. Wow, it's quite an informative session. I must say it's quite relevant. Also, from Naya's story, specifically in the prohibitive measures that came into play for people that were harvesting sea turtles, a cultural practice that really, as Chair has mentioned also, is the story of Africa. It's in one form or another. It has played over and over and over and over again. The significance there being also, it goes beyond Africa. In Brazil, there's a project called Tamar. So an NGO that started working closely with indigenous people who were catching turtles also for consumption and for cultural uses. But they soon realized that that it's not working, because what they are more creating is conflict. They are putting themselves in a position of having a revolt. So they started to learn to break down a system of conservation and embedding it in the local indigenous people. So they asked for their help. So the theme of listening, of going into communities, not with the lens that I am in a place of educating people, but in a place of I know nothing and I want to learn. And then what was incredible in that is that the community started to open up, to trust, to allow this conservation agency to exist and function in their community, number one. And after that, they've had like multiple stories of success. So it's just one example that shows the significance. And also, Ife mentions in a lot of things that are quite interesting, mentions call it the fight of shell by the communities in Niger. It's quite striking that to this day, we, as the general public, as scientists, as people in government, I will leave aside the business because, and under that umbrella, for me, Shell falls under that umbrella. We haven't realized that the only reason why these mining moguls, these huge companies, are able to continue to rape, in lack of a better term, in the moment, the environment, is because they use our division to their advantage. So what has really, I attended a stakeholder engagement for a scoping that was done by Total. So Total is also proposing a seismic survey on the southwest coast of South Africa, 60 kilometers of Cape Point. And in their stakeholder engagement, there were about like 14 people. I was the only young and Black person in the room. And their drive in this process was they want everyone to know. They held it in town, in a CBD. It costed me for parking 45 rands, as an example, to be in that stakeholder engagement. So the issues that I raised there were, if you really want to talk to the people that are going to be impacted, the people that are going to feel the first ripple effect of whatever is going to culminate from this project, you should be there. You should be in a hall that has no proper concrete, because that's where you'll find the people that are impacted. So it really also shows that there is a long way to go, and many people are just doing a stakeholder engagement consultation. That term also came out here, just to tick boxes, is to say like, no, I consulted. And I asked the question, do you think Cape Town is represented in these 14 people you have? Are you happy? Shell, they hired SKR, environmental impact assessment consultants. I said, I'm not going to pose this question to you, because I think the question is supposed to go to Total. So I left the consultants and I said, are you happy? Is this what you want to be actually, when we reference and look back in your engagement, is this what you want us to reference? So we indeed really have a long way to go. And Tanya mentions as part of the mechanisms that we need TEFs, especially quoting the scenario in Chile. What is scaring me, Tanya, on that is how do we then move to the management now, putting it into practice and also taking into account the background of the different countries we are doing conservation in. Specifically, as Pebs mentioned, the issues that we are having here in South Africa. People were dispossessed. People their land was taken away from them, colonization/apartheid, but it all wore a blanket of conservation. So right now, it's very difficult as a young marine biologist to actually go to communities and speak to them, because I automatically am also in that blanket of people that are pushing the agenda of conservation. And inside conservation is an onion. When you peel it, you see colonization, you see apartheid. So trust is unfortunately, we need to do a lot of work before we can get there. So it's a very challenging space. I'm so inspired to be here and listen to the different approaches and the knowledge, the wealth of knowledge. And Prof also mentioned something that is very key for me, which is customary fishing systems. I'm sure the chair knows this much better than me, because he's also affiliated with Amadiba. In South Africa, we had chiefs that would have what is called an open season. I'm cognizant of time. I have only 1 minute. I think on the next session, I'm going to speak to the opportunities in relation to the project I'm currently working on. But the chiefs would actually tell the people, their people, we are opening a season now. People can hunt game, people can fish, and then also close. And they had incredible systems of managing, and everyone was part. So they knew if Loiso goes against the community and go fish on his own, then there's going to be repercussions. So it was an intricate, and it worked very, very well. So those are the things that we still have to bring back to life, because they were there. Because also the term of visibility, to be visible and invisible at the same time, is really what is hurting to many indigenous people, because we are there. And then our government does not provide mechanisms of acknowledging us. Our government consists of indigenous people. So it's easy for us to trust our government to represent us, to take these critical and key issues, advocate them for us, but it hasn't happened. So yeah, I'm just inspired, and I'm happy for an opportunity to at least also share a bit. I'm really cognizant of time, so I'm gonna leave it here for now. Thank you so much, everyone.
Loiso, if you had some other important points to make and you'd like to spend another 2 minutes or so, please feel free to do so. As I'm saying, I'm trying to make sure that you are able. So if you still have got a few more, we can go a little bit over time, and we can always, because we're all here, we're going to give the break to ourselves. So it's not a train smash.
I'm indebted to you, Chair. Thank you. So I will just now mention, in light as a young person, number one, and when tapping into now opportunities. So currently I'm working on a project called the Seas of Good Hope World Heritage Site project. So this is a proposal for taking marine protected areas around the South Coast, including bits of the West Coast and bits of the East Coast, into elevating them to a World Heritage status. And then the first question or dilemma we come across has been mentioned here is this is a Northern Hemisphere approach, and it always they are imposed on people. There is an example of Isimangaliso, World Heritage Site along the East Coast. When you zoom in, you realize how it's disservicing the people, that it was, they were used as a flag, while at least they were lobbying for this project to happen. So in essence of the Seas of Good Hope World Heritage Site, there are two components, and one component is the natural, is the biodiversity. But the second component is culture. And I'm going to speak more to the culture because it links to indigenous knowledge. It links to the upliftment of culture and co-governance, basically. So what we are trying to do with that component, we are trying to identify adjacent to these marine protected areas, there's 16 of them, areas of cultural significance. And then the idea is to, one example, for an example that the chair might know better also is Cove Rock or Gompo Rock along the East Coast. So this is an area that has an incredible story tied to it. And to us, the Xhosa people, there is a great Xhosa prophet that fought in the British colonial war times. And he went to one of these rocks to pray for our ancestors to come and help to defeat the British powers. So to Xhosa people, we go and pray there. And the fact that he chose that rock was precisely because of its proximity to our ancestors. So the ocean has an incredible and an immense role to us. So what we're trying to do in giving back the recognizing indigenous knowledge is to say we want to protect the culture. We want to loop it back into what we term conservation today. We realize that this is a northern phenomenon, but we want to integrate it to what South Africa has. And Pevs mentions the program that is happening in Betty's Bay and Claremont, which we actually were learning a lot from, whereby there is MCCMs, Marine Coastal Community Monitors, which are local people that go out and monitor their oceans. That is very empowering because we had an opportunity to chat with people there. And then they said to us, you scientists, the issue we have is you come here because you are chasing a PhD, a master's, and then you disappear. So we give you all our knowledge. You go and do whatever you're supposed to do, and we never hear of you. So, and you come, you raise expectations, which is, I think that's the time we do. We commit when we interact with communities. So what we are trying to do, we're trying to learn from such important initiatives and replicate them across all the 16 MPAs such that we have alternative livelihoods. But at the core is to have young people taking a charge of the protection of their heritage. 5 years, 15 years from now, we're going to be sitting in one big table and we're going to be asking ourselves the question, why do we have MPAs in South Africa or why do we not? So looping us in right now is core. So that is it's an incredible project. It's very close to my heart, but it adds to everything that has been said here, really, in terms of what are the opportunities, what are the next steps. So thank you so much Chair for offering me the platform, and thank you so much to everyone for those insights.
Okay, thank you very much, Loiso, for sharing all those insights with the group. Now we're gonna take a break for 15 minutes, so which means we can come back at 11 minutes after 1. So thank you very much, everyone. See you later in 15 minutes time. Cheers.
Hello everyone. I hope we are all back. Okay, yes, I see Naya is back. Hi, Naya. I'm gonna start off this next session with firstly words of gratitude from the different stories that were shared and based on from different parts of the world. More than anything for me, it really shows how uniform the problem we are trying to solve is. It's different contexts, but we are all really trying to slay the same beast. For this one, we are going to talk a little bit about what are the key potential actions that we can take since we've identified different challenges and mentioned. I know we are quite limited. I'm quite a passionate individual, and I see this in everyone here. And I know that almost all passionate people will have stories to tell. So we are quite limited when it comes to time. So I'm gonna suggest we take an approach of themes now, such that we can cover as much ground as possible. And I think, Maria, this calls really for a second session whereby we could build onto whatever we come out with from today. So we're going to speak to identifying potential actions and then evaluate how feasible are these. And for me, it makes sense in my mind when I think of which are the low-hanging fruits, which are the easy ones we can pick quickly in going forward. We spoke about challenges, so I wouldn't want us to speak more on challenges at the moment, but also now the next step would be to define different roles and key groups for the actions. I am gonna give over to Naya. I'm gonna follow the previous chair's approach. I'm gonna give over to Naya just to speak briefly on potential actions. What are the feasibilities of us reaching these?
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm so sorry to come in as a convener, but Pavs has just sent a message through saying she's got to jump off at 13:30. Could we possibly start with Pavs?
Oh, perfect. Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Sorry for that. Thank you.
Naya. Okay, please, Pavs, you can take the floor.
Thanks, Louisa. So is my understanding correct in that you want us to look at a way forward on how we address some of issues working around Indigenous stewardship?
Yes, please.
And is this in the context of a project or just collectively our projects going forward?
Yeah, I think for now, if we keep it in the different realms we have, which would be our projects, then it's much better for us when we convene again to know this is what we can build on top going forward. Yeah, okay. So, I mean, it's obviously a very complex space to well, I wouldn't say complex, it's a complicated space to work in because it is fixable and it does take one. So I think the first thing would be to fully understand where we sit within our various projects. I mean, as you mentioned, the MCCMs, we're quite far down the line within the WWF project. So that project's been going for 8 years now. And the lessons learned from that project, I think, will be invaluable for this group as well. And we're formalizing that in a bigger Southwest Indian Ocean agreement as well. And we're going to be having other sites in Hamburg, in the Eastern Cape, where we're working with communities, Port Edward and Port Nolloth as well. And all of those are adjacent or abutting a marine protected area. And I think that, to your point around how do we see better engagement around that? So that's the one thing. The other thing where I definitely see an area of collaboration and coordination is through our marine protected area work. We're going to be doing something called the objectives workshops. And I think it will be great for this forum to be part of it. And what the objectives workshops do is they look at beyond the management effectiveness of an MPA. What is the actual biodiversity value of an MPA? Why is it there? Nobody can tell you why an MPA is there and why are we declaring it. So to actually
quantify and then in an economic sense, the value of an MPA. Using both what the community see of value and what the scientists see of value, what government sees of value as to why an MPA exists. So, you know, we have put in extensive MPA management systems. We've got a lot of staff that operate an MPA. But if I go to an MPA and I say, okay, so what's the biological value here? None of them can give you an answer. You know, so that's the objectives workshop. And then the idea around that is to say this MPA is protecting so many species. It's allowing for so many species to seed fishing areas. You know, so that's the idea around this. And then obviously with the community being part of that workshop to see what they value in that MPA. You know, and so definitely there's a space I really think this forum could contribute most valuably to, and in turn share some of their learnings in that space. And there, once again, it will be hopefully very strong on the community side to understand what the community in those areas. So I think those kind of workshops where we start putting value to those things. The other thing that I think this group needs to think about as well going forward is what we believe in nature-based solutions. So how do we, you know, come up with projects that are basically working with nature as opposed to against nature or extracting of nature, and finding those nature-based solutions with communities. And how do we finance those? It's great having nature-based solutions, but we need to find ways of financing nature-based solutions with communities. And it's voices like ours that can speak to funders, that can get to innovative financial instruments. How do we get there to communities where we're using that indigenous knowledge? And then I think the last part would be, how do we shift behavior? You know, how do we, both of the various stakeholders in the system, but also within the communities that we work with, how do we shift those behaviors? And I think those are big areas that we really need to think going forward to, because in order for anything to change, somebody's behavior has to change. And people don't realize that. We impose solutions. We haven't thought about simple things like, maybe it's just an issue of there's too many frictions. Maybe it's just an issue that there isn't enough infrastructure. You know, so it's simple. So where my thinking is going, for example, we're working with small scale fishers to find alternative markets. And that's my last point, is how do we give communities market access? You know, we want to give them market access. We want to allow them to take their catches where they can get better value from. But if you don't provide ice and freezers, there's no way they're going to be able to get their values worth in terms of market access. You know, so those are the, you know, and the other thing is, if you say to a fisher, a fancy restaurant wants your fish, well, then the fish have to be treated in a certain way for the restaurant to be able to buy it. So in that comes capacitating those community members and looking at what we call those choice architectures that we start changing around those communities. And then obviously mutual, I would immediately say that speaks to beneficiation. You know, using the natural resources for the benefit of local communities, whether it's through ecotourism and penguins, whether like we do currently at Stony Point in Berries Bay, or whether it's through ecotourism and taking people around on tours, talking about natural environment, whether it's looking at alternative nature-based solutions around charter fishing or viewing whales or whatever. We need to build the support structures that fit these particular activities. It's wonderful to say, oh, we're going to help this community become ecotourists, and we don't build the infrastructure that helps support it. And that kind of speaks back to my point around financing those kind of activities and how we get that business acumen within the communities, with the communities, and then build along. I think those are just some key touch points I think that we need to think about taking forward. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Peps. Yes, amazing. Yes, indeed, Peps. And what I get from this is, how do we, because we have the platform, how do we connect across our organizations to empower these communities. I'm going to give over now to Naya to also share a bit with us.
Thank you so much. Well, I've been observing a lot and just learning, soaking in everything that you guys have been sharing. And just a quick story, because I always go with stories because they, at least these are episodes that have marked me some way as a student, as an as an aspiring researcher. We were doing some back in the days. I was working with seabirds, and I was with this professor from the University of Barcelona, and we were searching for sheer water, in English, sheer water nests in some cliffs. And we were prospecting because scientifically that was the most, most likely the place that would be nesting and breeding. And we searched for the whole day. We found one nest. On the way, luckily we found a farmer. He was also on those cliffs, and we were talking to him. They were looking for nests, and we showed him a picture of the bird, and he's like, "Oh yes, they're all around, and they have many nests." And he showed us at least 15 nests in less than an hour. And we felt absolutely stupid and dumb. We were, in fact, stupid and dumb with all our gadgets and books and theories. And this is just to show an example of how local or indigenous knowledge has to be valued, first of all. And that sometimes we need to do sometimes or most of the times we need to do the reverse. We need to listen. We need to sit down. We need to go and listen to the people. So I think this is one of the actions that we need actually to install in academia, is to, from the get-go, tell students that although we are learning in books and learning the theories, the first thing we need to do when it comes to conservation, when it comes to ocean science, well, all of them, but since this is what we're focusing now, the oceans, we need to listen to the people that are the main knowledgers of the ocean, people that have lived there for, in many cases, centuries, millenniums in these areas, that they know nature better than us, or at least in a way that we don't know. So listening and putting this in as part as well in the curriculums, understanding indigenous knowledge and valuing, documenting it as well. This should be reinforced, I think, in academia, not even at the university level, but at an educational, elementary, middle school. This is a point of action. Education, it's very important, and not just a typical education when it comes to understanding the value of conservation, the value of species and biodiversity, but also understanding the value and importance of indigenous knowledge. Another thing that I think it's important is that indigenous local communities are also integrated in all phases of conservation projects. From designing the projects, implementing the projects, monitoring the projects, and that this should be actually, a national or regional strategy that these communities are. It's almost like a must be. I think like a lot of funders now are demanding, for example, for gender balance, for some, they have some topics that they demand, some requirements, that this should also be a strategy, a requirement, if we're talking either nationally or a regional or even a continental strategy for us. And well, there's so many things, there's so much that we need to do, but there's so much we can learn from each other. So perhaps if we can have a platform, a very feasible, practical platform, and I suggested this on the other discussion panel as well, on the other workshop, where we can easily create forums for all levels of people, between academics, between technicians, indigenous leaders, indigenous people, fishermen, where we can, because we will often see that we have common problems, but often we will have different solutions, and solutions that can be adjusted and adapted in different places. And conversation, listening, talking, sharing is the most important part. And I think all Indigenous communities do this within themselves, sharing, passing their experiences through stories. So why don't we continue this and use the technology that we have today in our advantage, and try to create platforms that, while protecting the information and respecting traditional practices, we can also share, we can also learn from. So, and just the final one, I don't want to cover, I don't want to speak too much, but I think that, and I think Tanya made a very good point on the importance, the scientific importance of MPAs and how they actually help restore a lot of ecosystems. And this is something that is needed. There's 2 points that we need to make in this, is that most of the traditional Indigenous practices are not that damaging to the ecosystem. Usually we have other groups or big companies, multinationals, or developed countries doing most of the harm. But luckily or unluckily, most of the places that need to be protected are where Indigenous communities are. So usually the solution is to create alternative livelihoods. When, for example, we need to close an area for fishing. So I think it's very important that we strategize and create livelihoods that not only, that don't depend as much on ecotourism. Ecotourism is one of the possibilities, but with COVID, we've seen how we couldn't do any tourism. Cabo Verde is a country that had half of its GDP coming from tourism, and the country is now struggling immensely economically because we had 2 years of no tourism. So how can we create a diverse group of alternative livelihoods, strong alternatives that not only can give people a job, but generate wealth? And when I say wealth, I'm speaking about money. I'm speaking wealth in terms of infrastructures, because sometimes we don't need money, we need infrastructures. I'm talking wealth about ecosystem wealth. So how can we have alternative livelihoods that generate wealth, that are resilient, that are diverse, to try to compensate when we need to install MPAs that might be more restrictive than others, because some MPAs are not that restrictive. So yeah, so those would be my take. Yeah.
Amazing. Yes, thank you so much, Naya. And one thing that I think I can speak to a little bit on the forums. One option that we can have an international forum based on email addresses. I'm part of an MPA help larger. It's a global email address, I guess, and then an expert would send a question, and then different people get an opportunity to answer. And then there's one person that would curate those answers and to put them in a list, and then say, Loiso asked this question about Indigenous stewardship, and then these were the answers that came through. It's really, really helpful. So that would be incredible, I think, idea for us to take this discussion, because there's so much to talk about. But also
social media, right? Usually everyone has social media, so why not create a social media just for Indigenous knowledge?
Exactly. Since you also, Naya, mentioned a lot on mechanisms, I think I'm going to ask Tanya to come in now here also and speak to us. And then after, I'll ask you, Ife, to ready yourself in the meantime. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Loiso. And I just wanted to say I really appreciated your conversation earlier about your intervention at the meeting at Total, and I love that you're up there speaking for youth. I think it's amazing. I've been working a lot with youth organizations in Europe in the last few months for the Ocean Conference, and I love it. I love having all these young people around that are just challenging their ideas, asking the difficult questions, don't care that it's an awkward thing to raise in the middle of a different meeting, just actually asking the questions that need to be asked and thinking, out of the box, which I think it's so important. And youth are part of the solution for sure, and should be at every single conversation in the same way that Indigenous knowledge needs to be there. Youth needs to be at every conversation. We need these new ideas. We need questions, challenges. So important. So I was very happy to hear that. So in terms of ways forward, I think the idea of a forum is fantastic. I love that idea. I was going to suggest that, some kind of a knowledge voice communication channel, like a Slack channel, where we could have an Indigenous stewardship kind of grouping that can just talk to one another. So not only necessarily questions, but actually have conversations that other people can follow and track and contribute to, because we need to start listening to one another. So that I think that the education of people in general, communities in general, is so important about the ocean. And this is where I think a social media, perhaps a Facebook page or some kind of face for this conversation should be put out there on a platform where people can start sharing stories, because that's how we're going to connect with people's hearts, how we're going to get them to listen to us, how we're going to get them to actually think, gosh, I really do need to change the way I think about that, or listen to that community, or maybe I don't actually need to buy that plastic bottle today, or whatever. Just start sharing information with people. So many people are not aware of the crisis that the ocean is in. Just everyday people. I was speaking to someone earlier today, and a lovely human being, but she had no idea that the ocean had any kind of issues. It's hard for us to believe because we're in the ocean community, but some people are just completely oblivious. When we need to change that, we need to change the narrative. Ocean needs to be on the same platform and the same level of understanding as climate change. Ocean change is as, if not more significant than climate change. So a youth collective, I love this idea, and it just came up now in my head, but what about having an African collective? Like in Europe, they have this thing called Eurasians Youth, and it's funded by Surfrider. I think Surfrider have got tons of money and funding from foundations. Maybe somebody could approach Surfrider, I can give you the introduction, to set up an African oceans grouping of young African academics and researchers and advocates, biologists, whoever, media people, across disciplines. It doesn't have to be a scientist, but people that can contribute and actually go into meetings with a voice representing African youth. At the United Nations, there should have been an African youth representative there speaking, and there wasn't. And then I think we need to align what is going on in science with what's happening on the ground. So for example, in the Western Indian Ocean at the moment in Africa, I know about 2 research projects that are happening, both funded by the EU, both massive, lots and lots of money going into research on how climate change is impacting local communities, and another one on how the physics of the ocean is changing with plankton, etc., and how that is impacting the fish, and how that then impacts the local communities, and how we're heading for major starvation in the Mozambican Channel within the next 10 years. So these scientists need to be connected with communities. They need to be connected with people on the ground so that they can actually relate because these projects are already happening anyway. So we may as well get on board with them, and actually link them to real life experiences and real life knowledge, and link up the dots, because they're happening anyway. So let's just jump on and use that so that it's useful for us. And then the research community, what I thought was, it would be so amazing if we could create a project or an action where we raise some funding and we get this group of people together and a few other people, and we take some international examples and we look at how we can turn them into locally adaptable, flexible solutions that can be applied in different communities. So not only necessarily in Africa, but in other communities, other Indigenous communities around the world. But we can have obviously a specific African slant on ones that are for Africa. But for example, the thing you brought up about turfs, so how do we take that idea, which works, and the idea of chiefs opening the season and closing the season? How do we take those 2 very different impulses, but actually achieving the same thing, and make them work for Africa? How do we take other initiatives that are happening around the world, like what's happened in Belize, or many other innovations that are happening, and actually look at them, talk to the communities, learn from them, and actually create some frameworks or some flexible solutions that we can apply at a local scale. Those are my ideas for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tanya. You are reminding me, I was going to pull up quickly an article I read last night about an example in India where these temples where people pray, they actually are contributing to the protection of biodiversity. So by protecting that cultural, spiritual belief, you are actually protecting biodiversity, because the belief is if you have a place of worship, if there's no birds, there's no snakes, there's no biodiversity around, that area is already void. So the spirit you are praying unto is actually not there. So it's really, there's so much that we can pull together and come up with the best solution that is going to be specific for the different regions we are looking at. Yes, I'm going to give over now to Ife to also share with us her thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louisa and everyone. Thanks, Tanya and Naya and Pavi for the contributions you've made so far in terms of the recommendations and what needs to happen differently. Without rehashing what has been already said, I want to first of all sort of touch on and clarify that, of course, I do agree that MPAs can potentially be a sustainable and, one of the best ways to support efforts to ensure sustainable marine resources or oceans. But at the same time, it can also be one of the most damaging, depending on how it is done, and which is why it is very important for us to look at it from country by country perspective. It is futile to implement something due to pressure from outsiders when you do not have the wherewithal to enforce what you're implementing. And the reality is that for many countries on the continent, even those that have implemented things like closed season, for example, we're seeing people, unfortunately, abusing the laws because they can't actually enforce it. So I guess one of the necessary steps then in terms of thinking about solution is to ensure that even when we are recognizing that the indigenous communities have a voice and have a role to play, we have to find a way to ensure that policies are implemented. And one of the things that Pavi talked about, which is very important, is unfortunately, even when we have really great policies, the implementation requires money. And so money ends up becoming a big challenge. And the reason why something that started as well-intentioned have not worked properly. If we're talking about like all the things we've talked about so far, we can talk about supplementary livelihood, complementary livelihood, alternative livelihoods. You require money for this to happen. And without that political will and the commitment of the government to go the extra mile, including attracting international partners that might be willing to support some of these things, it will not really be, in terms of the long-term solution, be effective. So the question then is, how can we ensure that communities are then also able to generate money, as a way of bridging those gaps rather than rely on external actors all the time? And this is why, again, I have to point out the need for exploring things from a case-by-case basis. So Tanya talked about, potentially with MPAs using tourism or relying on tourism. You can say maybe this might be the case that might work in a country like South Africa, might work in a place like Cabo Verde, but we know that in many countries in West and Central Africa, due to the risks to piracy and other threats, tourism have not really begun in the way that it should. And so we know that realistically, you cannot necessarily say that tourism would be a safe bet for them, because the security risk in those areas currently means that even the potential investment they could generate from tourism is not happening. So, and I feel, and based on at least the engagement I've had with communities with whom I've worked, sometimes the solution might be a case of opening up land, farmlands. Because realistically and traditionally, this is what they have done. In the low seasons when the fish is not there, they've almost always relied on farming. And then when the high season comes, so in the low seasons, in the high seasons, they harvest their crops. And then in the high season, they plant, right? And in the low seasons, they harvest. And so this sort of bridges that gap between one relying on any government that already doesn't have the money. And so you find that this could be potentially the solution. And countries like actually with cooperation with cooperative societies in Cote d'Ivoire are already exploring these things, wherein village chiefs are donating lands to cooperative society and they're exploring this thing. I visited a project in September last year, and I think things are likely to be more effective if they can get more support, you know, from other village chiefs or village heads and even government, because we find that sometimes unless these things are sustained, it will not work. Of course, you might think, why isn't this continuing? Unfortunately, because of the interest in the oceans, so many people that have lands and even the government are selling lands around the coast for coastal tourism. So the lands that were once available to communities for them to plant or grow crops is no longer available. This is why they are not willingly or easily able to continue in this trend. And so I feel that, one of the ways or one of the solutions we can explore is how can government support communities to revitalize these practices? Because the realistic thing is there's no money. And so we have to be looking at practical actions. Another thing is education, because sometimes communities know the right thing. We know that the industrial sector contributes most significantly, but at the same time, communities do unfortunately contribute to depletion and degradation of the environment. And so it might be a case of re-educating and being willing to educate and be patient and come to their level rather than stop-start. Again, the stop-start happens a lot because maybe the funding started and there's no continuum. And then when a new project comes, it forgets about where, like, it doesn't take over from where it stops. It brings different thing altogether. So there's a need for synergy. I guess now that I'm saying this, I'm looking at international communities, international partners that might want to collaborate or work with communities on the African continent to think about how they can synergize their efforts rather than, duplicating efforts, which ends up actually bringing about waste of the resources we say is not there. Importantly, and I can't reiterate enough, the need for revisiting Indigenous practices. It might be that closed seasons might work, and based on the examples, and I will publish the research on this last year on sort of how efforts to sustain the ocean environment is undermining the features who we describe as the small-scale sector. I think that it's very important that the government revisit the possibility of revitalizing Indigenous practices. Historically, in many West and Central African countries, and even East and Northern African and Southern African countries, they have traditionally had this, you could call it closed season, but like a day where they don't go to fish, or even 2 days where they don't go to fish because they believe it belongs to the gods. The gods are resting, they must not be disturbed. So imagine we have, how many days in a year do we have? Or 52 days in a week, right? And imagine in a week, we have 1 day compulsory or 2 days in a week out of the year, 52 days in 52 weeks in a year, where people do not willingly, because they have been re-educated and they understood the need to not go to fish. One, the government would not have to waste money that they do not have in trying to find complementary livelihood opportunities in the 1 month closed season, which after the 1 month, everybody goes back to sea and fish till they drop. Imagine if we revitalize or brought back or re-educated people to understand the need for us to revitalize this 1 day no fishing, these 2 days no fishing. It is possible. I have seen communities throughout West and Central Africa that continue, but individually continues to practice this because historically they believe their ancestors needed to rest. The gods, the mammals, marine mammals needed not to be disturbed. So imagine a scenario where, the scientific knowledge has spoken to us. It has told us of the need to sustainably exploit or sustain marine resources. Now we are revitalizing Indigenous practices that is already there on the continent. I feel that, given resource constraint, these are just some of examples of how we can practically take a step further and go beyond, speaking about everything else and taking everything else that we've talked about, the need for cooperation, collaboration, and everything else that's already been highlighted by our colleagues. Integrating these things together can help us to go a step further in achieving the ambition of the Africa we want. It's very soon. I guess sooner than later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm having goosebumps as you speak, because when I think specifically on the concept you spoke about of land and sea, the link of land and sea during times of plenty in the sea, we plant on land, such that when there is less on the sea, we can harvest. It's said that actually in the conservation space, we are doing ourselves so much disservice. We are missing so much because this knowledge is already there. It's just for us to tap into. And that is what we are missing out. It's so sad for me as a young person, because I've never really been involved in that practice, and I long for that practice. So it's very interesting. And also conservation for different countries is only as strong as the government, as the policies. So I like what you say about the case-by-case scenario is important, because if a government is corrupt, a beautiful project is just not going to work. There's so much to unpack on this. I don't also want to take a lot of time. I'm cognizant of our time. I want to give an opportunity to our chair, Mr. Sinekuku, but I also want to ask him, after sharing, to kind of highlight for us what are his takeaway, key highlights for him. And then after he speaks, I will see if we have a bit of time to actually give each and everyone else a 1, 2, 3 points. I think this is going to be important for Maria too. I'm jotting them down also, but what are the takeaways from this? I hope you are with us.
Loiso. Yes, I am here, but it might be a little bit noisy with the wind, but I hope you can hear me. Can you?
Loud and clear,
Okay,
sir.
yes, yeah. So I think for me, first looking at the first session, is blown away by the fact that all the challenges are the same. It doesn't matter where you go, all over the world. And yeah, whether you go to Latin America, to Southeast Asia, everywhere, we have the similar challenges of the Eurocentric approach to MPAs, and that has got to stop. And I think in my wildest of dreams, I think it would be nice if we could, as per deliberations of this gathering, that we can start putting together a document, whether it's a one-page document that says these are the challenges as perceived by Indigenous people, and this is the desired way forward from Indigenous people, how they want. And then that particular brief document, whether it's a 1 page or 1.5 or 2 pages, can then be taken by various organizations and people who have got links with Indigenous people, to have people to input in that document, to add, to subtract. And then we could have something in the conference next year that would actually be put forward as the kind of way which can go to all levels, continent wide. It can also go to the permanent meeting on Indigenous people under United Nations, but it kind of a document that is well informed, that is commented on by Indigenous people all over, that we could be able to say, even for all the organizations that are driving the campaign of 30 by 30, that they actually have something. But it's important that it's not coming from us as we gather here, but it's a document that is going to be discussed with the goal of gathering the opinions of Indigenous people who are affected by all of these things that we are mentioning here. And the second suggestion is that there are organizations, I think, under the World Oceans. World Oceans are under the World Trust. There is already a youth collective, Youth for MPAs, and I think those if we could have one of the organizations that work with the oceans, like WWF, like the World Oceans, which is a wing of the World Trust, they could develop a repository where all these lessons and the films and the videos and the voices of Indigenous people could be deposited. For instance, here in Ponoland, we have our own films where the local people talk about the ocean, talk about these particular challenges. One of the things I get over and over again, people questioning the why they are being persecuted by these law enforcement agencies and all that about the ocean. I know that they have gone to court, which was a long court battle for them fighting for access to the ocean because the MPA was prohibiting them from getting an access to marine living resources. So I think if we were to have a repository where all of these voices from these Indigenous people could be, which a repository that would be available to researchers, but also for other communities anywhere to learn from, to learn about what are the other people doing somewhere. And I'm saying that something that could be hosted by the
apologies.
Having
Apologies.
active website.
Apologies, Sinegugu. You were cutting, so there are parts where I struggled to follow you a lot. There are parts where I could piece together, especially after the repository as a good idea. So I'd like you to just start off around there. Sorry for disturbing.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thanks a lot for that. Yeah, as I'm saying, being out, the wind is picking up now, so which might be the reason why I am cutting. So I was saying, if therefore we could have that repository, and then we would be able to share all the lessons from all the other MPAs and in Indigenous communities that are adjacent to the MPAs, and then which so it could be hosted by any of these organizations that are already doing amazing work within the ocean and the MPAs. I know there is WWF, there is the Wild Oceans, which is part of the Wild Trust or the Wild Conservation Trust in KZN, that has got the Youth for MPAs. So, but also I think for me, the other very important thing is in terms of the MPAs, the ocean, the marine resources, and gender, youth and gender. So how do we actually give space to the voices of the youth who are the future leaders? And also how do we give women, because women in particular in the collection of the shellfish, they are very, very central. So I think we need to start making space available for the youth and for women voices to actually to be heard. And I think it's something which could be included in that working document, if we agree that we could have that document, so that by the time we get to the conference next year, then we already have been around the continent, around the world, collecting these voices and share what the people say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Sinegugu. I think you'll be encouraged to hear that I initiated 3 weeks ago a group using media advocacy. So the call sent out actually was just to have young people have their say on what an MPA is and what it means to them. And then that's when I partnered with Youth for MPAs. And then I learned that Youth for MPAs, there's also an African group. So that would be incredible. I support that. It's a good step. So on the 1st of August in South Africa, we're having an MPA day. And then the plan is for next year to have a African different youth voices added also. So that, that's already, there's already some groundwork happening on there, and then we can build onto that nicely. So I'm gonna give off to you, Tanya, quickly, I am so sorry. I know that we have maybe 2-3 more minutes after 2, but I'm not sure who's going to stay. But yeah, your 1 minute key takeaways for us and yeah, going forward. Thank you. You are on mute, sorry.
So my focus is going to be with the project I'm working on, which is to set up an intergovernmental panel for ocean sustainability to ensure that youth and Indigenous knowledge are included in a legitimate and real way going forward. I think that's absolutely critical. And I think what we've learned today is that nothing works without authenticity and legitimacy of the people in which it relates to. Every intervention that we take, every decision that we make has to be contextualized into the environment that it relates to for it to have any chance of success. And I'm very inspired by the conversation today and really look forward to being part of this group and working with all of you to develop this African narrative going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Ife, your 1 minute.
So, I mean, I'd like to say, or should I say, re-echo what everyone else have said. It's really refreshing to know that despite the challenges which we all recognized, we're not necessarily where we need to be, but then we're not where we used to be. So I'm actually leaving here, this conversation today, very hopeful and absolutely excited that there are so many Africans that are actually working hard on the ground to help our government do things differently. And long may that continue. And I hope it gets to a point where we can actually finally get to start centering the people that matters around these issues. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Naya?
Oh man, it's been really feel very honored to be here, really learning from all of you, from all your experiences. And I think the biggest takeaway is that, and it's something that I think Sinegugu has also mentioned, is that we all have the same problems. They might go in different ways, like small different aspects, but we all face the same issue. And well, the ocean is a global, it's as global as it gets. And I think we need to work more connected, I think. We are in an era of communication, but lack of connection. So we're communicating a lot, having a lot of information, but connecting really, we're lacking of it. So I think that's the biggest takeaway, is to use these platforms, use these opportunities, share our stories, listening, and connecting. Very, very important to connect. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Naya. I would like to, for me, to just go back to the concept, to the notion of Ubuntu. And I'm going to borrow my grandfather's words on that. He once said to me that we are looking at the concept of Ubuntu very shallowly. It is much more deeper than what we think it is. Only the notion of being kind to one another, it's fundamental for a society. But once we get it right, what oozes off of that is harmony with our environment, is harmony with nature, is healing, is putting us in that incredible, much needed balance. So whatever we do in our different projects, we must strive towards perfecting our understanding of Ubuntu, our understanding of what is the footprint we have in the environment we find ourselves in. So that is all from my side. Thank you so much to you all. It's been incredible. It's so much lessons. I feel so honored. I'm gonna give off back to Moria to have any closing remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, I'm just trying to get my video going, not reacted. I don't know if, there we go. I don't know if I have enough bandwidth. Guys, this workshop has been the reward for the sleepless nights over the last 2 weeks. This conversation has been so inspiring. And you guys have actually come up with the most tangible potential outcomes out of any of the workshops I've been in, and they are all fantastic, and I can't wait to follow up on them. I am doing wrap up for 9 different workshops. So I'm warning you now, you've seen how long it takes me to get back on bills. I want to be thorough about this, and it might take me up to a week to come back on this. I'll just start a great group thread so everyone's on the same page. And I'm really looking forward to the follow up. And this is, like, I think this subject is what I was most looking forward to, and it's really going to inform us going into the summit. And I plan the program for the summit, and I coordinate the speakers. So I'm looking forward to seeing all of you in Cape Town in February 2023, because I need all of your insights on various discussions. And this workshop, there are so many of the other workshops that are linking into it. And with these ideas that you've had, I can pull in people from the other workshops like Babatunde Adeleke from Wild Oceans. The conversation we were having yesterday, which was also very fruitful, he would definitely be able to bring in, I mean, he's working on MPA financing for Isimangaliso at the moment, through Indigenous stewardship and all kinds of different things, and that he was there for a nature-based solutions workshop. It all ties in so nicely. So I can't wait to follow up, and thank you all so much for giving me this into the workshop series. I am so grateful and honored to have had you here. You're all on mute. Unmute yourselves.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been amazing. Yeah. Take
Thank
care.
you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
I look forward to being in touch soon. Well done.
Don't forget to link us all, Amora.
Yeah, I'll send out one email with almost nothing written in it, just with everyone's email addresses, and then I'll do proper follow-up in about a week.
Great.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Bye,
guys.